1,500 yards out in the dark, a young American sailor had another warship locked in his gun sights, and the order came through to open fire. His name was Patrick Park, and he was seconds from pulling the trigger when something stopped him. It turned out the ship in his crosshairs was his own side. It was the Turner Joy, an American destroyer, part of the same task force, sitting in the Gulf of Tonkin that night. So if two of our own ships nearly tore each other apart in the dark, what exactly was everyone shooting at for the next 3 hours? That question is the reason 58,000 Americans would die in Vietnam. And the answer sat locked inside a government safe for the next 40 years. Before we go any further, picture where this is happening. The Gulf of Tonkin is a stretch of open water off the northern coast of Vietnam, tucked between the mainland and the island of Hainan in the South China Sea. In the summer of 1964, it was one of the most dangerous pieces of ocean on Earth, because 2 American destroyers were sitting in it, right on the doorstep of a country the United States was not yet at war with. One of those destroyers was the USS Maddox, and officially, the Maddox was just out there on a routine patrol. That was the first thing the public was told that would turn out to be false. Everything you are about to hear is on the record now. The cables the captain sent, the messages the government intercepted, the admissions that came decades later from the Secretary of Defense himself. We are going to lay it all out in the order it happened. Because the story America was handed that week and the story buried in the classified files are 2 different stories. And the space between them is where a wall covered in 58,000 names came from. To see how a single night in the dark became a war, we have to back up 2 days. Because on August 2nd, something real did happen in that water. And it is the last part of this story where anybody agrees on what that was. The Maddox was not simply cruising. She was running a mission the Navy called a DeSoto patrol, and her real job was electronic eavesdropping. Packed into a steel van on her deck sat a team of intelligence specialists whose entire purpose was to listen. They intercepted North Vietnamese radio traffic, mapped the location of coastal radar stations, and fed everything they caught straight back to the National Security Agency. Hold on to that fact, because it becomes the whole point later. The ship at the center of this story was working for the very agency that would one day bury the truth about what happened to her. On the afternoon of August 2nd, 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats came out after the Maddox. This part is real. The boats closed in, the Maddox opened fire, and aircraft from a nearby carrier came screaming down to join the fight. When it was over, the torpedo boats were shot up and limping home, and the Maddox had taken a single machine gun round in her hull. 1 bullet. That was the sum total of the damage to the American ship. But a real shot had been fired, and in Washington that was enough to put everyone on a hair trigger for whatever came next. Here is what Washington did not tell the American people about why those boats came out in the first place. Just before this, South Vietnamese commandos had been raiding North Vietnamese islands in the dark, hitting radar sites and coastal defenses. These raids were run under an American program, planned with American help, a covert operation the public knew nothing about. So from Hanoi's side, an American spy ship was sitting off their coast at the exact moment their islands were being attacked. To them, the Maddox was not an innocent bystander. She was part of the assault. That context, the thing that made the whole encounter make sense, was kept out of the story entirely. 2 days later came the night that changed everything. And this is where the ground gets unstable, because on the night of August 4th, it is very likely that nothing happened at all. A storm had rolled over the Gulf. There was no moon. The sea was heaving. Both destroyers, the Maddox and now the Turner Joy alongside her, were far out in open water, with their radar screens fighting through rain and clutter. And then, the reports started. Torpedoes in the water. Enemy boats closing in. The sonar operators called out contact after contact. The ships opened fire into the dark and kept firing, throwing hundreds of shells at targets nobody could actually see. For hours, this went on. And in all that time, across 2 ships full of trained men, not one sailor ever laid eyes on a single enemy vessel. Remember Patrick Park at his gun station? He had a target locked, a solid shape out there in the black water, and the order to fire came down. He was ready. And then he realized the shape he was aiming at was the Turner Joy, his own sister ship, 1,500 yards away. If he had pulled the trigger, he might have sunk an American destroyer full of Americans. Think about what that tells us. If a gunner nearly fired on his own ship by mistake, in that chaos, in that dark, then how much of everything else that night was real? And how much was frightened men chasing shadows on a screen? The man who understood that best was right there in command. Captain John Herrick was aboard the Maddox, and even as the guns were still going, he was growing certain that something was wrong. He got on the radio to his superiors that same night, and the message he sent should have stopped the entire chain of events cold. He told them the whole action looked doubtful. He said freak weather effects on the radar and over-eager sonar men may have accounted for many of the reports. He said there had been no actual visual sightings, and he urged them, in writing, to hold off and carry out a complete evaluation before anyone took further action. The commander who was actually there, in the water, in the dark, was telling Washington to wait. Washington did not wait. There was another man with the clearest possible view of that night, and he was not on a ship at all. He was in the air above it. James Stockdale was a Navy pilot flying over the Gulf during the supposed attack, and years later, he would describe what he saw with total certainty. He had, in his words, the best seat in the house, and what he saw was open water. He watched the destroyers below him firing wildly, and he saw no torpedo boats, no enemy wakes, nothing but black water and American firepower. As he put it, our ships were just shooting at phantom targets. The pilot circling directly overhead could not find an enemy that the men below were firing at for hours. And here is the cruel turn. Stockdale, who knew there was nothing out there, would soon be ordered to lead the retaliation strike for the attack he was certain had never happened. He understood exactly what that meant. The country was about to go to war over an event he had watched with his own eyes and knew to be empty. He kept flying. He kept his mouth shut. And what he knew stayed buried inside him for years, because not long after, he was shot down over North Vietnam and spent 7.5 years as a prisoner of war, carrying the secret that the war, which imprisoned him, may have started over nothing. If you are getting value from how this story fits together, the single best thing you can do is watch the next video we will point you to at the end, because the pattern you are seeing here did not begin in 1964, and it did not end there either. Stay with us, because what happened in the 72 hours after that phantom night is how a ghost became a war. The machinery moved fast, and it moved on the version of events that Herrick had already warned was doubtful. Within a day, American bombers were launched against North Vietnam in retaliation for an attack that the man on the scene said probably never occurred. One of those pilots was shot down and captured, becoming one of the first American prisoners of a war that had barely begun. and he would not come home for more than 8 years. But the bombs were the smaller half of it. The larger half was political. The president went before the nation, and then before Congress, and asked for the power to use whatever force he saw fit in Southeast Asia. Congress gave it to him almost without resistance. In the House of Representatives, the vote was unanimous, not a single member against. In the Senate, only 2 men refused. Their names were Wayne Morse and Ernest Gruening, and they deserve to be remembered. Because they stood alone, Morse said flatly that he believed the country was making a historic mistake, and that future generations would look back with dismay at what Congress was doing. He had been tipped off by someone inside the Pentagon that the story did not add up. He was right, and it would take the rest of the country years and tens of thousands of lives to catch up to what those 2 senators saw in that moment. With that vote, the door was open. The resolution became the legal foundation for everything that followed. The ground troops, the escalation, the long, grinding war that would consume more than a decade. All of it rested on the events of a stormy night that the commander on the water had flagged as doubtful within hours. A wall of names was now inevitable, and it grew from an attack that the men closest to it could not confirm had ever taken place. For years, the official line held. The government stood behind its version, and the men who doubted it were not heard. But the truth did not disappear. It sat in the files, waiting. Then came the admissions, slowly, from the top. Decades later, the Secretary of Defense who had helped sell the attack to Congress began to walk it back. In interviews near the end of his life, Robert McNamara admitted that the second attack, the one on August 4th, simply did not happen. He said it plainly. It was confusion, and the judgment that the ships had been attacked was wrong. This was the man who had stood before the Senate and used that night to justify a war, now confirming, in his old age, that the event was never real. And in the 1990s, McNamara traveled to Hanoi and sat down with the former North Vietnamese commander to settle the question directly. He asked what had happened on August 4th. The answer he got was that on that night, absolutely nothing had happened. Nothing at all. But the deepest proof was not a confession. It was a document, and it had been sitting inside the National Security Agency the whole time. An agency historian named Robert Hanyok was studying the old signals intelligence from the Gulf, the intercepts the listening teams had gathered on those nights. And when he went through the raw material carefully, he found something that turned the official story inside out. The intelligence that had been used to prove an attack on August 4th had been mishandled. The single most important intercept, the one treated as the smoking gun, was not evidence of a new attack at all. It was a North Vietnamese message about the earlier fight on August 2nd, about towing and salvaging the boats that had been damaged 2 days before. It had been mistranslated and misdated in a way that made an old, real event look like a new attack that was happening in real time. And it went further than one bad translation. Hanyok found that the intercepts which supported the idea of an attack were passed up the chain, while the far larger body of intercepts that told the true story, that no attack was underway, were left out. By his account, the overwhelming majority of the relevant signals intelligence, the material that would have told the truth, never reached the decision-makers at all. Roughly 9 out of every 10 pieces of that evidence were filtered out of the reports that shaped the response. What Washington saw was a version of the night assembled to fit a conclusion, not the raw truth of what the listening posts had actually caught. Now here is the part that matters most, and we are going to be careful and honest about it, because this is where the story is often pushed too far. Hanyok did not conclude that the president ordered a cover-up, or that the top of the government cooked the books on purpose to start a war. What he described was a distortion that happened lower down, among the analysts, and he judged that it was done in large part to cover earlier mistakes rather than as a grand political conspiracy directed from above. The agency itself has disputed even his account, and a number of Navy veterans still believe an attack did take place. So we are not going to tell you this was a scheme masterminded at the top. What the record shows is narrower and, in a way, more unsettling. The evidence was bent to fit the answer people wanted, and the truth was left on the floor. Which brings us to the safe. Because Hanyok finished his study, laid all of this out in careful detail, and then his work sat locked away, classified, for years. The agency did not release it, and the reason it finally came out tells you everything about why it was buried in the first place. As the study sat there, the country was in the middle of a fresh argument about intelligence being shaped to justify a war, this time in Iraq. Officials inside the agency worried that releasing a document showing intelligence had been skewed to launch the Vietnam War would draw an uncomfortable comparison to the present moment. So they kept it shut. It only saw daylight after a researcher pressed for it, and a reporter at a major newspaper exposed that the agency was sitting on its own historian's findings. Only then, near the end of 2005, did the report finally reach the public, more than 40 years after the night it explained. Step back and look at the whole shape of it. A destroyer sits off an enemy coast, secretly listening on behalf of the National Security Agency. One night, in a storm, that ship reports an attack that the evidence says never happened. That report is used to launch a war, and decades later, the proof that it never happened is found inside the very agency the ship was listening for, and that agency keeps the proof locked away for another 40 years to avoid an inconvenient comparison. The loop closes on itself. The people who had the truth first were the ones who buried it longest. The men who died did not get to read that report. The names carved into that long black wall in Washington were set in stone decades before the document that questioned the reason for it all was allowed to surface. 58,000 Americans and countless more Vietnamese on the far side of a night that the commander on the water, the pilot in the sky, the Secretary of Defense in his old age, and the agency's own historian all came to doubt. So when someone tells you the file is closed and the official story is the final word, remember the Gulf of Tonkin. Remember that the proof was real, that it existed the whole time, and that the hardest part was never finding the truth. It was getting anyone with the power to lock it away to let you see it. If that pattern interests you, the next video is waiting, and it picks up exactly where this one leaves off.